Hello my fellow weirdlings, it's Margot, and today we're exploring a disturbing trend called phrogging, the secretive occupation of someone else's home. So if you're ready to get really paranoid about your attic, closets, or crawl space, keep watching. Though it may sound like an urban legend or a plot to a horror movie, real victims of phrogging have ranged from everyday people or families to some of the world's best-known celebrities. Phrogging, spelled with a PH, is defined as the act of secretly living in another person's home, without their knowledge or permission. It's called phrogging because perpetrators, known as frogs or phroggers, tend to hop from one place to the next like a frog. Some phroggers are simply looking for a place to sleep, while others are in it for the thrill. Still others use phrogging to aid in committing other crimes like burglary or stalking, and in some cases for even more nefarious reasons. Some phroggers will stay in a home completely undetected by its inhabitants just for a night, while others have managed to secretly cohabitate for up to a year before being caught. As you'll see from the real-life phrogging stories I'm about to share, phroggers come in all shapes, sizes, ages, and backgrounds, and they all have their own reasons for phrogging. You might be wondering how phrogging differs from the better-known practice of squatting. Both relate to taking up residence in a space they're not legally supposed to be in, but the key difference is that squatters normally take over unoccupied areas like abandoned buildings, while phroggers move into properties that are already currently occupied. Both squatting and phrogging are illegal and can result in similar criminal charges, such as breaking and entering and trespassing, with phrogging commonly including charges of stalking, harassment, and/or burglary, which can lead to serious jail time in some cases. Phrogging is generally considered more creepy and invasive than squatting, leaving victims feeling psychologically violated. Thankfully, while probably more common than we're aware of, phrogging is still pretty rare, or at least getting caught at it is. I'll start off with a couple of the most unsettling celebrity phrogging stories to ease you into the more horrific and disturbing incidents that have happened to ordinary people. Actress and model Pamela Anderson's 2001 phrogging incident was truly bizarre. At the time, Anderson was living alone in Malibu, California with her 2 young sons. She'd first begun to notice that food and clothing items had gone missing and began to fear she was going crazy. Then one day she was horrified to see a stranger's face peering into her house through one of her windows. Anderson called security, but they couldn't find anyone on the property. Later, the trespasser was reportedly found asleep on a bed in Anderson's home. The phroggor turned out to be a 27-year-old homeless Frenchwoman named Christine Evelyn Roth, who'd been staying in Ms. Anderson's pool house for 3 or 4 days. To raise the creep factor on the situation, when the woman was caught, she was wearing Anderson's iconic red swimsuit, which she'd made famous on the show Baywatch in the 1990s. The intruder had apparently found the swimsuit in Anderson's bedroom. The woman was then, according to Anderson, slicing her wrists and holding a rather awkwardly phrased letter, disclaiming that she wasn't a lesbian, she just wanted to touch Pamela Anderson. Ms. Roth was arrested on a misdemeanor trespassing charge of unauthorized entry of a dwelling, given a psychiatric evaluation, and ordered to return to France and seek counseling. Roth may have actually trespassed on Anderson's property at least once before, as a woman matching her description had been spotted a month earlier, but had left before authorities arrived. Authorities wanted to charge her with stalking, but lacked sufficient evidence. When the police asked Anderson if she wanted the red bathing suit back, she told them to keep it, which opens up a whole new mystery of where that iconic piece of Hollywood history ended up. Following the unsettling incident, Anderson now keeps her last remaining Baywatch swimsuit locked up in a safe. Thankfully, this phroggor, while definitely really creepy, was seemingly non-violent. George Michael wasn't quite so lucky. In 2004, the singer was chatting with a friend one evening in his London living room when he thought he heard someone calling his name. The voice seemed to be coming from beneath his floor. While trying to wrap his mind around that realization, a crazed woman appeared in the room. Michael quickly called the police and the trespasser was arrested after allegedly punching one of the police officers. It turned out the woman, 28-year-old Lucy Novak, had been living under the floorboards of Michael's house for about 4 days. She'd somehow been able to enter from outside, where the split-level mansion, built on a slope, was propped up on stilts at the rear. When caught, she had a book from Michael's home in her possession. Michael decided not to press burglary charges, and the police let Novak off with a harassment warning. But unfortunately, that wasn't the end of the story. Later that same day, police were called back to Michael's home. Novak was already trying to make contact with him again. She was arrested nearby and issued another caution for harassment. 2 days later, Novak allegedly forcibly entered Michael's office, not far from his home, and broke into his rural cottage the following month. Michael reported seeing Novak in his yard several times following those instances. During the time Novak had been frogging under Michael's house, she'd managed to obtain his private email address, as well as private contact information for other celebrities. After she was caught and released, she began sending Michael alarmingly threatening messages. Police began to fear that George Michael could suffer the same fate as John Lennon, who was murdered outside of his home in 1980 by a deranged fan. Novak was once again arrested for the threatening messages and for returning to Michael's property. Michael sent a written statement to the court requesting Novak receive psychiatric care instead of imprisonment. She was ultimately sent to a psychiatric hospital, where she hopefully got the help she clearly needed. Eventually, she was given a 2-year conditional discharge and a restraining order to stay away from George Michael and his boyfriend Kenny Goss. Other celebrities whose homes have been invaded by froggers include Jennifer Lopez, Brad Pitt, Rihanna, and Sean Diddy Combs. This next story is even more unsettling. In 2019, newlyweds James and Brittany Campbell and their 2 young sons left their home at Joint Base Pearl Harbor-Hickam in Honolulu to visit family on the U.S. mainland for a week. When they returned, there was a strange bicycle sitting outside. When 36-year-old James tried to open the front door, he was unable to do so. He soon realized there was someone holding it shut from the inside. Grabbing a sledgehammer for protection, James forcibly removed the stranger from his home, while 37-year-old Brittany called 911. James later described the ordeal, saying, "There's a man peeking through the door. He's trying to hold it shut. And the man says, 'This is not your house,' just very calmly. I am just floored." Once the man was outside, James said, "We noticed he's wearing my clothes. Things are getting crazier by the moment." Authorities soon arrived and arrested the trespasser, who turned out to be 23-year-old Ezekiel H. Zayas. It seems Zayas had moved into the Campbells' home as soon as they'd departed on their vacation. But Zayas' arrest was only the beginning of the Campbell family's terrifying frogging experience. The family was completely horrified by what they found inside their home. The whole house was trashed, with their furniture soaked in bodily fluids. All of their possessions were thrown around and destroyed, and the kitchen was filled with strange concoctions, with pots and pans piled on top of each other. In the living room, James's musical equipment had been taken out, and the couple's bedroom was in complete disarray. But that's not the worst of it. Knives were laid out on a bed as if prepared for a medical procedure, and there were disturbing writings and videos left behind on an old computer of the Campbells. They detailed Zayas' plans to perform gruesome surgeries on the family, including a manifesto which mentioned such procedures as sexual reconstruction and a hand transplant. He wrote that he could make the Campbells into, quote, perfect people. The couple were also disgusted by an unsettling video of Zayas sitting naked in Brittany's chair. Brittany later said, "I just felt terror." If the Campbells hadn't immediately encountered Zayas at their front door when they returned home, and had instead been ambushed walking into their house or later, I shudder to think what may have happened to them. Zayas had written detailed diary entries about each family member, leading the police to believe that he'd been watching them for some time. The entries even mentioned the fact that Brittany was undergoing fertility treatments, which the couple hadn't told anybody. The Campbells recalled strange recent events that suddenly began to make sense to them. A webcam turning on seemingly by itself in the middle of the night, doors inexplicably becoming opened or unlocked, and their dog barking for no apparent reason. It's still unclear how Zayas had gained access to the Campbells' 2-story house or how long he'd been frogging there. Zayas was charged with burglary, but the judge allowed him to have unsupervised release, to the Campbells' horror. They were only granted a restraining order against him. A few weeks later, Zayas was arrested again for allegedly vandalizing a Buddhist temple. While in custody for that, he apparently tested positive for COVID-19 and was placed in a quarantine cell with 2 other inmates. One of those inmates was 62-year-old Vance Grace, who only had weeks left on his sentence. For unknown reasons, Zayas brutally punched and stomped Grace to death. Zayas was charged with first and second-degree murder. He pleaded not guilty and was declared unfit to proceed with a trial, and was placed at the Hawaii State Hospital. As far as I can tell, that's where he is today. After Zayas was in custody, it was discovered he'd been reported missing by his mother from Bridgeport, Connecticut, about a month before he'd been discovered in the Campbell's home. His mother requested he be returned to Connecticut, but that hasn't happened. James and Brittany Campbell are still recovering from the psychological trauma of their ordeal. They've since moved away from Hawaii. Brittany said, "This is an incident that has really affected us psychologically as a family. It's uprooted our entire lives. Recovering from this has been really difficult." Shifting gears a little bit here, this one's a good example of how froggers can have widely varying personal reasons for their frogging. In Providence, Rhode Island in 2003, a 32-year-old leader of an artist cooperative named Michael Townsend was informed that he was being evicted from his condo because the building was being torn down and replaced with a supermarket parking lot. The same developers who'd forced Townsend from his home were also responsible for building the nearby Providence Place Mall. According to most retellings of this story, this gave Townsend a brilliantly petty idea to exact a little bit of personal retribution, though Townsend tells a different story. According to Townsend, while mulling over his options, an ad came on the radio that would change the trajectory of his life, or at least his plans for the next few years. On his website, Townsend wrote, "During the Christmas season of 2003 and 2004, radio ads for the Providence Place Mall featured an enthusiastic female voice talking about how great it would be if we could live at the mall." The central theme of the ads was that the mall not only provided a rich shopping experience, but also had all the things that one would need to survive and lead a healthy life. This inspired Townsend to see if he and 7 of his artist friends could manage to live at the mall undetected. Townsend happened to know that within a hidden area of the Providence Place Mall, there was about 750 square feet of unused space that apparently very few people were aware of. Townsend had discovered this space while out on his daily jog back in 1999, while the mall was being built. During construction, the hidden room had been used to store building supplies. Townsend confirmed that the space was still unused and seemingly forgotten in 2003, so he and his friends proceeded to turn it into a small apartment. They built a cinder block wall with a nondescript utility door to keep the room hidden from the outside world. Inside, they set about transforming the room into a home, adding a sofa, a dining table, a PlayStation 2, and even a hutch filled with fine china. The one thing the makeshift apartment lacked was plumbing, so the artist-turned-froggers used the mall's bathrooms. For the next 4 years, they basically lived in the mall undetected, staying there for up to 3 weeks at a time. They'd all sworn to keep the apartment a secret to everyone outside of their small group. Then, in 2007, mall security caught wind of the unorthodox living arrangement that had been going on for years right under their noses. The artists returned one day to find their utility door kicked in. Their PlayStation, art, and a photo album were gone. They'd been robbed. It was later learned that the robbers had actually been members of mall security who'd taken those specific items in an attempt to determine the froggers' identities. After the break-in, the artists took extra precautions, including only using the apartment at night, but mall security was now basically staking out the apartment, waiting to catch one of the inhabitants in the act. That finally happened one afternoon when Townsend brought a visiting artist from Hong Kong to see the apartment, and upon walking through the door was greeted by 3 mall security guards, who turned the 2 trespassers over to the police. Townsend's visiting friend was allowed to leave, and Townsend, who refused to name any of his co-conspirators, was arrested and charged with misdemeanor trespassing, along with his ex-wife Adriana Young, who identified herself as a fellow mall dweller. Townsend pleaded no contest and was ultimately given probation and banned from the Providence Place Mall for life. He never had to serve time in jail. Townsend later said he'd had plans to make the apartment, quote, super sweet, with laminated wood flooring, a second bedroom, and a finished kitchen with updated cutlery, but he never got a chance to see those plans through. Providence Place Mall spokesman Dante Bellini Jr., who seemed to be feeling a little bitter, described Townsend's mall abode as little more than an area with stuff in it. But Providence Police Major Stephen Campbell admitted he was, quote, surprised at what Townsend was able to accomplish, though he was quick to point out that what he did was clearly criminal, as the mall is private property. While Townsend's Artist Cooperative considered their experiment with mall life to be an art project, Townsend has also said it was more than that for him, stating, "Living in the mall is great. I'm saddened that I'm not allowed to ever return to the mall again, but I understand. The mall made me think very carefully about what we buy." He claimed that the entire endeavor was done out of a compassion to understand the mall more and life as a shopper. Though the term phrogging has only been coined in recent years, the crime of phrogging has been around for much longer. One case that proves this is by no means a new trend is that of Theodore Edward Coneys, also known as the Denver Spider-Man. In September of 1941, 59-year-old Coneys was down on his luck in Denver, Colorado, and decided to visit an old friend, 73-year-old Philip Peters, to see if he could offer him any assistance. When Coneys arrived at the Peters house, no one was home, so he let himself in, presumably to help himself to some food and money. While rummaging through the home, he found a small trap door that led to a cramped cubbyhole in the attic. There, he took up residence for the next 5 weeks, only coming down from the attic when he heard Peters leaving the house. On October 17, 1941, when he thought the house was empty, he went down to the kitchen to scrounge for food. Unfortunately, Mr. Peters was at home taking a nap and was awoken to the noise of Coneys rummaging in his kitchen. Peters confronted Coneys at his refrigerator and struck at the intruder with his cane. Coneys proceeded to beat his old friend Peters to death with an old pistol he'd found in the Peters house and an iron stove shaker. He then went back to his hiding spot in the attic cubby. Police were puzzled by the murder, as all of the Peters house's windows and doors were found locked after the attack, and Peters had no known enemies. Though the house was searched, the cubbyhole in the attic wasn't, because the police didn't believe an adult could fit through it. During Coneys' occupation of the attic, leading up to Mr. Peters' death, Mrs. Peters had been in the hospital recuperating from a broken hip. Upon her return home, Mrs. Peters began hearing strange noises in the house, and her housekeeper quit, believing the house was haunted. Mrs. Peters eventually moved out to western Colorado to live with her son, but neighbors and passers-by still reported seeing lights turning off and on in the supposedly empty home. On July 30th, 10 months after Coneys had moved into the Peters attic, police finally checked on the house and discovered Coneys. From there, they figured out he'd murdered Mr. Peters and was sentenced to life in prison. Local newspapers gave him the moniker the Denver Spider-Man of Moncrief Place, after a police detective commented, "A man would have to be a spider to stand it long up there." In 2012, a 41-year-old woman named Tracy in Rock Hill, South Carolina, began feeling an odd presence in her house, and there were strange sounds keeping her awake. She'd pretty much chalked it up to paranormal activity. But then, on a Saturday night, she was able to trace the weird noises to her attic, and nails started falling from the ceiling, as if her house was coming apart at the seams. Tracy and her eldest sons went to investigate the attic, but didn't find anything unusual. Her sons teased her about getting old and senile. Later that night, Tracy was using her laptop in bed when plaster began falling from her bedroom ceiling. She later said, "I kept hearing a bumpin' thumpin' noise. It was either something or somebody was in the attic. I know the sounds of my home." At around 2:30 a.m., Tracy was awakened by loud sounds coming from her attic. She called her nephew to investigate. This time, a man was discovered hiding at the dark end of the attic. He managed to rush past them and ran out of the house. The man turned out to be Tracy's ex-boyfriend, whom she dated 12 years earlier. He'd made himself somewhat of a nest in her attic heating unit, with coats and jackets. Tracy and her kids were disgusted to find a collection of Sonic cups that the Frogger had used as makeshift toilets. They were even more disgusted and disturbed to find that the man had adjusted the air vents so he could look down at the family throughout the house below. Tracy believed her ex had possibly lived in her attic for as long as 2 weeks, ever since he'd been released from a 90-day jail sentence for previously stealing her truck. Tracy did call the police, but they couldn't track the man down. She told the media, "We're still trying to figure out how he got in the house. I want him charged. I feel violated." In 2008, a male homeowner lived alone in Tokyo, Japan, or so he thought. When he began to notice food disappearing from his fridge, he first assumed that he'd been sleepwalking, although he'd never done it before. He still had an uneasy feeling, so he double-checked that he'd locked all of his doors and windows before leaving his house. Still, food kept disappearing. Finally, he installed surveillance cameras throughout the house. Shortly afterward, the cameras caught something truly terrifying. When the man was asleep or away from home, the cameras caught footage of a woman moving throughout his house, eating food from his fridge and watching TV in his living room. Of course, he called the police. They searched the home and found a 58-year-old woman who'd been living in the top compartment of a spare closet for nearly a year. She admitted she had nowhere to live and had originally gained access to the man's home on a day he'd accidentally left his front door unlocked. She'd even brought a mattress into the closet and had been using the man's shower. Other than food, water, and electricity, nothing was stolen. Police described the trespasser as neat and clean. The woman was arrested for trespassing. This one is one of the most disturbing phrogging cases on record. Phroggers sometimes form a parasitic attachment to a homeowner or a home itself, and that's certainly the case in this terrifying story. But it got far worse from there. This story could be very triggering for survivors of sexual assault, violent crime, or the loss of a parent or child. In 1986, 16-year-old Tina Bowen seemingly lived the life of a fairly average teenager in Pepperell, near Townsend, Massachusetts. She shared a home with her father and sister Kathy. The family had recently suffered the loss of the girl's mother to cancer. According to most reports, 16-year-old Daniel LaPlante was a schoolmate of Tina's. The two teens had become friends, mostly by chatting over the phone, and had even gone on one date to a local fair over Easter break of that year. But their personal realities were vastly different. Daniel's childhood had reportedly been plagued by physical and sexual abuse at the hands of his father and later a psychiatrist. It's been said that his father despised him, while his mother believed he was a golden child who could do no wrong, so he was constantly pulled between these two extremes. It's mentioned that the yard of Daniel's home was described as a mess of junk and old cars, and Daniel himself was described by schoolmates and teachers as a loner and not particularly friendly. By age 15, Daniel had become the neighborhood thief, spending his evenings sneaking off through the woods behind his house into people's backyards, breaking into many Townsend homes and stealing the occupants' valuables. Soon he graduated to playing mind games, leaving objects behind or moving things around in his neighbors' houses, just to scare them. By age 16, Daniel had become obsessed with Tina Bowen, but during their one date, Tina had been put off by Daniel's appearance and was made uncomfortable by his barrage of questions about her mother's death. And afterward, other kids at school reportedly informed her that Daniel was facing rape charges. According to Tina's father, Frank, that was the end of her contact with Daniel, or so he thought at the time. One night in the fall of 1986, Daniel snuck into the Bowen family's home without their knowledge. He initially hid in a wall cavity next to the bathroom. Over the course of several weeks, from a crawl space reportedly no wider than 6 inches, he psychologically tormented the family. After watching Tina and her sister attempting to contact their deceased mother with a Ouija board, Daniel began pretending to be a ghost, responding to the girls' questions with a rhythmic knocking from within the walls. Soon, the girls began to suspect that the spirit they were supposedly in contact with wasn't their loving mother. Daniel would terrorize them by making strange noises in their house, and he'd wait until they went to sleep or left a room. Then he'd crawl out of his hiding spot to eat from their refrigerator, drink their milk, rearrange random items and furniture, and change TV channels. He even left urine in their bathtub, and pennies scattered around their floor. He emptied bottles of alcohol without drinking them, and left disturbing messages on the basement walls, written in mayonnaise and ketchup, which the girls assumed was blood. They'd say things like, "Marry me," and "I'm in your room, come and find me." At one point, the Bowens found a family photo pinned to a wall by a knife, and scrawled with the threat, "I'm going to kill you all." Frank Bowen believed his daughters were simply struggling to accept their mother's death and pranking each other. While annoyed and concerned with the girls' well-being, he didn't take any of the shenanigans too seriously. Daniel was careful not to cause too much disruption while Frank was at home, but he'd do subtle things designed to make the family argue amongst themselves. Then everything changed on December 8, 1986, when the girls returned home with a friend to find some furniture rearranged, and another seemingly bloody message, this time on the wall of Tina's bedroom. The girls rushed to a neighbor's house to call their father. When Frank arrived, he noticed the furniture to be in even more disarray than the girls had described, and realized someone had recently used their toilet. Mr. Bowen searched the house and discovered Daniel LaPlante crouched in his late wife's closet, wearing face paint and Native American-style jacket and a ninja mask. Disturbingly, he was also wielding a hatchet. LaPlante proceeded to take the family and the girl's friend hostage, placing them in a bedroom before disappearing to another room in the house. Tina managed to escape through a window and called the police from a neighbor's phone. LaPlante fled and wasn't apprehended until police found him 2 days later, after Frank Bowen spotted LaPlante in a window when he returned to the house to retrieve some personal belongings. He was found hiding beneath the Bowens' house in a triangular space in a corner enclosed on two sides by a concrete foundation and an inner wall. They could see that LaPlante had been living there for weeks. Upon investigation, police were shocked and the Bowen family was horrified to find that LaPlante had been secretly living in a crawlspace between the walls that separated the toilet and the plumbing pipes for nearly a year, spying on all of the Bowens' private moments. Following his arrest, LaPlante was held in a juvenile facility until October of 1987, when his mother remortgaged her house to raise his $10,000 bail. While awaiting trial, LaPlante immediately went back to business as usual, burglarizing local houses. On October 14, 1987, he stole two .22 caliber firearms from a neighbor's house. 2 days later, on October 16th, he burglarized the home of the Gustafson family, which consisted of pregnant nursery school teacher Priscilla, her husband Andrew, their 7-year-old daughter Abigail, and their 5-year-old son William. LaPlante normally robbed houses that were empty, and this burglary was no exception. Unfortunately, the next one was. Less than 2 months later, on December 1, 1987, LaPlante walked through the woods behind his house back to the Gustafson family home, carrying one of the .22 caliber firearms he'd previously stolen. He later claimed he didn't expect anyone to be there. When he heard Priscilla and her young son Billy in the house, he claimed he considered jumping out of a window and running away. I find those claims difficult to believe, considering what he decided to do instead. He ambushed Priscilla with the gun and took her and Billy into her bedroom, where he shoved the 5-year-old into a closet, then tied the pregnant mother to the bed using makeshift ligatures, and gagged her with one of his socks. He raped Priscilla, put a pillow over her face, and shot her twice in the head, killing her. He then told little Billy his mother was sleeping, took him into the nearby bathroom, and drowned him in the bathtub. As he was leaving, Abby Gustafson returned home on the school bus. He led her into another bathroom and drowned her as well. Then 17-year-old Daniel LaPlante simply returned home and attended his niece's birthday party, as if he hadn't just committed the most heinous acts imaginable. Meanwhile, Andrew Gustafson had been trying to get a hold of his wife all afternoon, and was worried when she hadn't answered the phone. He was even more concerned when he returned home to a dark and silent house. He found his wife dead, lying face down on their bedspread. He then fled the house and called the police. He later said he didn't look for his children because he was afraid he'd find them dead. LaPlante was easily identified as the prime suspect using forensic evidence. Police found the shirt and gloves he'd worn to drown the children in the woods behind the Gustafson house, still wet. Dogs tracked the scent from the shirt to within 3 or 4 feet of LaPlante's home. The evening after the murders, LaPlante was interrogated, but at the time, police lacked sufficient evidence to arrest him. They planned to return the following day, but LaPlante went on the run, and a statewide manhunt ensued. But he didn't run far. Following a burglary spree in Pepperell, he was found hiding in a dumpster and promptly arrested on December 3, 1987. LaPlante went on trial for the murders in October of 1988. The jury found him guilty and he was given 3 consecutive life sentences. In 2017, LaPlante appealed for a reduced sentence. The judge found that even after decades behind bars, the murderer showed no remorse for his crimes. As a result, it was reaffirmed that he'd served the 3 life sentences. He'll be up for parole in 9 years. Since their ordeal, the Bowen family is still haunted. According to Daniel LaPlante's biographer, Joe Turner, Tina Bowen has actually managed to forgive LaPlante and doesn't hold any ill feelings toward him for what he put her through. She's preferred to stay away from the public eye and isn't active on social media. Her sister Kathy still can't sleep in the dark and is counting down the days until Daniel LaPlante dies. Andrew Gustafson died of cancer in 2014 at the age of 60. He eventually remarried and had 2 more daughters. He once said, "He could take them, but he couldn't stop my hope, life, faith, and building a new life," though he didn't know if he could ever forgive LaPlante. This alleged phrogging incident took place just last year and should be taken as a cautionary tale for all content creators. At just before 5 a.m. on February 9, 2022, a 24-year-old OnlyFans model, known only as In-R, called 911 after awaking to find an intruder in the hallway of her family's Somersworth, New Hampshire home. Police arrived to find 20-year-old Mauricio Damian Guerrero of Bensalem, Pennsylvania, climbing out of a window to the young lady's roof. It turned out Guerrero had been an OnlyFans subscriber who'd become obsessed with In-R. He'd traveled from Pennsylvania to New Hampshire, somehow made his way into the woman's mother's home, and had been living in her attic for days, judging by the leftover food and headphones he'd left there. According to local police, it was determined that the suspect entered the home with the intent to commit theft and invasion of privacy. While phrogging in the model's home, Guerrero secretly recorded her sleeping naked and reportedly stole her keys. He admitted to entering the home at least 4 times and told detectives he'd intended to put a tracking device on In-R's car. The victim's mother had actually been hearing strange noises coming from the attic. Guerrero was charged with 4 counts of burglary but was quickly bailed out of jail. While awaiting trial, he was required to wear a tracking device and barred from visiting New Hampshire or contacting his victim, who was granted a restraining order against him. According to the victim, Guerrero had stalked her online for months. They'd met through the OnlyFans website in October of 2021. She said he seemed nice at first, so when he asked for her address, claiming he was going to send her a TV and fireplace for her apartment, she gave it to him. She said she didn't want to actually meet Guerrero, but he was very pushy. Soon after she gave him her address, she said Guerrero began following her in his car and appearing outside of her apartment in Gorham, New Hampshire. She then went to stay at her mother's house in Somersworth, but Guerrero showed up there too. On the night of his arrest, Guerrero called In-R to say he was outside of the house, and she told him to leave. Hours later, she awoke to find him in the hallway. Crime is never the victim's fault. The only person to blame is the perpetrator. With that being said, there are sometimes precautions we can take that may minimize the opportunity for others to victimize us. Never giving out your home address or anyone else's to strangers online, whether they're fans or haters, is one of those worthwhile precautions. If someone's determined to find you, they still might, but please don't make it easier for them. We'll end this on a completely different sort of alleged phrogging incident. While seemingly less nefarious than most of these cases, this one's kind of a sad and somewhat confusing situation. In July of 2022, Carson City, Nevada police responded to a complaint about a 2-year-old walking alone in traffic outside of the Children's Museum of Northern Nevada. Deputies quickly realized this was their 2nd time at that location for the same sort of incident. They soon located the toddler's older sister, who gave the museum as their home address. Upon investigation, the officers discovered the girl was telling the truth when they found a hidden living space and a maintenance storage area within the museum that was seemingly housing a family of 7. The father of the family, 41-year-old Wilbert Calhoun, was the museum's janitor. His wife, Amber, was the museum manager. It seemed the couple and their 5 children had been secretly living in the building for months. During their search of the museum, cops found weapons hidden in a storage room near the art supply closet. An AK-47 rifle, 3 handguns, an AR-style pistol, 3 suppressors, dozens of magazines of ammunition, several knives, a taser, and a baton. The weapons were found in an unlocked room, which could easily be accessed by a wandering child, according to the police report. They also reportedly found drug paraphernalia, as far as I can tell just a used marijuana joint and a bong. Mr. Calhoun was arrested on weapons and child endangerment charges. The police report regarding this incident stated that Calhoun was known to deputies as being highly agitated and was known to have firearms, and that this was the 2nd call involving Calhoun and one of his children. According to police, Mrs. Calhoun wasn't present when deputies were dispatched to the museum, so I'm assuming that's why she wasn't charged with child endangerment as well. Both adults were fired from the museum. Board members, claiming complete ignorance to any prior knowledge of the situation, abruptly closed the museum and pledged to investigate before reopening. Later, Amber Calhoun told her side of the story in an interview. She claimed the family hadn't actually been living at the museum. According to her, they'd been living in low-income housing until recently, but, quote, they were just riddled with all kinds of pests and bugs, so when it came time to renew the lease, we didn't. We didn't want to deal with that. We saved up our money to try to get into a new place. Unfortunately, they were unable to find one in time, so according to Amber, they started staying at a hotel down the street from the museum. When they were unable to do that, they'd camp. She did admit to sleeping at the museum every now and then, but claimed that was due to her long work hours. On the day the couple lost their jobs and her husband was arrested, she claimed she'd been working on organizing a fundraiser at the museum, when her 2-year-old must have gone looking for her and wandered outside, though she denied leaving the children unsupervised for long periods of time. She had explanations for everything else too, though they're pretty sketchy in my opinion. She claimed the reason so many of the family's personal belongings, including clothes, dishes, sleeping bags, and mattresses, were at the museum was because they were making donation bins for the fundraiser and started them with their own discarded clothes, unused diapers, and toys. When that didn't explain why they had mattresses there, she said they were for a museum exhibit and activity she had planned. When asked about the weapons and drugs allegedly found hidden on the premises, she claimed her husband Wilbert has a background in security and several certificates from the California Security Training Academy, and that, quote, with the recent school shootings, he wanted to make sure the children were as protected as possible. He had medical kits there, everything that would be needed just in case. By medical kits, I guess she meant marijuana. I'm not sure if that's ever helped in an active shooter situation. The police also commented that Wilbert Calhoun didn't have the necessary permits to own suppressors or short-barreled rifles. Up until they were fired, the Calhouns were running a children's summer program and appeared to be the only employees working there. While the museum's board of directors claimed there were never any complaints about the Calhouns, and this had to be a brand new issue they didn't have a chance to find out about yet, parents of the kids in the summer program have adamantly stated that they'd complained, some of them repeatedly, about the recent cleanliness of the museum, the decline in quality of activities offered to the children, and a dangerous lack of supervision under the Calhouns' management. Summer program attendees, children who played with the Calhoun children during the program, said they had toys everywhere and did seem to be living at the museum. One woman who hosted a birthday party at the museum one evening entered a storage room in search of a broom to help clean up, and claimed she walked in on Mr. Calhoun eating a family dinner at a table with some of his kids. Everybody who's spoken publicly about this case has said the Calhoun's kids, and in particular the 2-year-old and 5-year-old, were always at the museum, seemingly never supervised and allowed outside by themselves. An ex-employee of the museum stated Amber Calhoun had been working at the museum for a year, and that the Calhouns had allegedly been evicted from their apartment for not paying their rent, and for Mr. Calhoun refusing to get a job to stay in the low-income program. According to the ex-employee, the family became homeless living in a tent before they began living in their 2 cars in the museum parking lot, which were packed with items. They said, they've been there for months and months and no one has cared. It would have been impossible not to know they were homeless and living there. Now, I'm not trying to shame the Calhouns for finding themselves without a home. In fact, an estimated 59% of Americans are just one paycheck away from homelessness. However, the Calhouns' carelessness with children and their care, if the allegations against them are true, are extremely troubling. I'm also troubled by the museum board's apparent deception and lack of interest in the day-to-day workings of the establishment and programs they're supposed to be in charge of. I think the parents of the community are right in raising a fuss about that. Amber Calhoun was quoted as saying, I ended up losing my husband and my job and basically my whole everything all in one swoop. She also said, I don't think I've done anything wrong. I wouldn't really do anything differently. I can only play the game with the cards that I was dealt and did my best as far as the summer program went. I haven't been able to find any update on Mr. Calhoun's criminal case. I'll admit, working on this one started to give me a smidge of paranoia. I've had a really bad stalking situation, and if sleeping in my car, camping in my yard, breaking into my house, or giving my address to authorities as his own count as phrogging, my stalker was also a frogger. That situation escalated into something truly insane, so I've been pretty vigilant about my privacy and security for years. Someday I'll tell you all the whole sordid story. While phrogging may seem like a harmless prank to some, our homes should be safe spaces for us, and phroggers strip their victims of that sense of safety, leaving them feeling violated and deprived of security. That's not funny, and it's not a game. It can be dangerous and traumatic for victims and could easily end in a frogger losing their life when detected. I can't stress enough the long-term effects of such a violation of privacy and personal boundaries. Also, interestingly, a lot of phrogging victims seem to write the initial signs of an intruder in their space off as paranormal activity. Things are suddenly moving around or going missing. Lights are turning off or on. If you've lived in your home for a while with no major renovations or life changes, and those activities are new, I'd really recommend looking for a non-paranormal cause first. You're also probably not just suddenly sleepwalking or going insane. Do a thorough search of your home or have someone do it for you immediately if anything seems amiss. That's all I have for you today. I hope you've enjoyed these stories and will come back for more. Like, subscribe, leave a comment, and bring your friends, family, COVID pod, cult members, invisible friends, or enemies. And if you have any thoughts on this topic, leave them in the comments below. Thanks so much for watching.